The early morning sun pushed through the small glass window of the bakery, throwing a long line of pale yellow light across the worn wooden floorboards. Hazel stood behind the counter, using the side of her hand to brush loose flour from her thick cotton apron. The rich, heavy smell of baking bread filled the entire room, a familiar scent that always brought a sense of quiet comfort. She had been awake and working since long before the town clock struck 4 times, kneading dough until her arms were heavy and her lower back throbbed with a dull ache. But the loaves were finally sitting on the long wooden shelves behind her, their crusts a perfect golden brown, each one shaped by her own tired hands. She was 22 years old, with dark hair pulled back into a tight, neat knot at the base of her neck. Her simple gray dress showed patches at both elbows, and her leather shoes were worn thin at the heels from years of walking on hard floors. She lacked the soft, white hands of the wealthy women who lived on the hill, but her quiet eyes were steady and honest when she looked at the world. The bakery itself was tiny, consisting of just a single main room with a service counter and a massive brick oven built into the back wall. The wooden floor creaked loudly whenever she took a step, and the old plaster walls showed signs of peeling paint near the front entrance. Despite its flaws, this place belonged to her, inherited from her father who had spent his entire life keeping the town fed. Now that he was gone, she was determined to keep the ovens hot and the doors open, no matter how difficult the monthly bills became to pay. Outside the window, the sleepy rural town of Pine Creek, Oregon, was just beginning to stir in the cool morning mist. A heavy wooden cart rolled slowly past on the damp street, its iron-rimmed wheels clattering against the rough stones. She heard a local fisherman down the block shouting about his morning catch, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance as neighbors opened their shutters to greet the day. The small brass bell hanging above the front door rang with a sharp, clear chime, drawing Hazel's attention away from her thoughts. A little girl stepped inside the shop, her thin cotton dress offering very little protection against the chilly morning air. Her feet were completely bare, covered in a light dusting of dark road dirt, and her small fingers tightly gripped a single copper coin. The girl looked up at the high counter, her voice sounding tiny and hesitant in the quiet room as she asked for half a loaf of bread. Hazel looked down at the lone copper coin and knew immediately that it was not enough to cover the cost, since half a loaf normally required 2 coppers. Instead of mentioning the price, Hazel reached up to the shelf, took down a massive whole loaf of warm bread, wrapped it securely in brown paper, and pushed it across the wooden counter. She told the girl to inform her mother that the price of bread had dropped today, causing the child's eyes to go wide with surprise before she grabbed the bundle and ran out into the street. Hazel picked up the single copper coin and dropped it into the small wooden cash box hidden beneath the counter, noticing how empty the box looked. She quickly closed the lid, refusing to let herself dwell on the lack of money, and focused instead on preparing the counter for the rest of the day's business. Lately, fewer and fewer customers had been walking through her door, a shift that caused her a great deal of quiet worry. Most of the townspeople had started buying their baked goods from the massive new shop on the main street, a modern establishment with a painted sign and assistants wearing pristine white aprons. The owner of that rival shop, a proud man named Mr. Higgins, had stopped by the previous week just to tell Hazel that her rustic loaves were only fit for country folk. Hazel wiped down the counter one more time, deliberately pushing thoughts of Mr. Higgins out of her mind so she could focus on her own work. The front bell rang once more, and Hazel raised her eyes to see a remarkably tall figure standing in the open doorway. The stranger wore a long, heavy cloak that was coated in dried mud along the hem, and his thick leather boots were deeply cracked from long miles of travel. He carried no bags, no walking stick, and no coin purse at his waist, looking exactly like a traveler who had spent weeks walking the dirt roads. He remained perfectly still in the entrance, his broad shoulders blocking out the morning light, as he quietly examined the small interior of the bakery. Hazel waited patiently behind the counter, having seen many weary travelers and displaced workers pass through Pine Creek looking for a handout. Her father had always insisted that a baker who turns away a hungry person is not a true baker at all, but merely someone who happens to own bread. "Good morning, sir," Hazel said, keeping her voice gentle but firm as she stepped closer to the counter. "May I help you find something today?" The tall man took 2 slow steps forward into the room, causing the old floorboards to groan under his immense weight. He stared at the rows of golden loaves on the shelves, and then he turned his gaze directly toward her face. "I have no coin to offer you," he said, his voice sounding much deeper and smoother than she had anticipated. It was the calm voice of someone who was accustomed to being listened to, even though his current appearance suggested he had nothing to his name. Hazel nodded slowly, showing no judgment or frustration, and reached up to select a large, fresh loaf that was still radiating heat from the brick oven. She wrapped the bread in a clean sheet of brown paper and held it out across the wooden counter toward him. "Take this," she said simply, keeping her arm extended so he could reach the food. The man did not move right away to take the offering, instead keeping his eyes fixed on her face with an expression of quiet curiosity. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his tone indicating genuine confusion rather than suspicion. The question caught Hazel off guard, as most people who came in looking for food took the bread quickly and departed with a simple nod or no words at all. "Because you are clearly hungry," Hazel answered, looking back at him without blinking, "and I happen to have an oven full of bread." The stranger continued to study her for a long moment, the tiny bakery falling into absolute silence around them, as the distant sounds of the street seemed to fade away. The rich scent of the warm loaves hung thick in the air between them, and Hazel could hear the steady rhythm of her own breathing. He finally reached out his arm to accept the wrapped bundle, and his long fingers brushed against her own hand as he took the bread. His skin felt shockingly cold, like river ice in the middle of winter, a freezing touch that made her breath catch in her throat. "Thank you," he murmured softly, turning on his heel and walking out of the shop before the brass bell could even finish its small chime. Hazel stood frozen behind the counter for several minutes, wondering why her heart was suddenly beating so rapidly against her ribs. He was just a traveler, she told herself, and she had given free food to dozens of travelers over the past 2 years without feeling this strange sensation. Yet there was something unusual about the striking contrast of his appearance, the grace of his movement, and the coldness of his skin. She shook her head to clear her thoughts, picked up her straw broom from the corner, and began to sweep the loose flour from the floor. That evening, after locking the front door and counting the few coins in her box, she sat down by the small hearth in the back room where she slept. The shop was all she had left after selling her family home to pay her father's remaining debts, and she lived a simple life, eating quiet meals and baking bread for the town. The following morning, Hazel was busy arranging the fresh loaves on the long wooden shelves when the front bell rang at its usual hour. She looked up toward the doorway and saw the exact same tall man standing there, wearing the same muddy cloak and cracked leather boots. He remained by the entrance, as if he were unsure whether he was truly welcome to step inside her shop for a second time. "Good morning, sir," Hazel said, offering a warm smile to ease his hesitation, as she wiped her hands on her apron. "I cannot pay you for food today either," the man stated clearly, stepping forward until he reached the edge of the counter. "I did not ask you for money," Hazel replied, reaching for a fresh loaf of bread without a moment of hesitation. She wrapped the warm loaf in paper, but before she could hand it over, the man leaned forward slightly, looking intently at her face. "Why do you continue to give your food to people who cannot give you any coin in return?" he asked. Hazel placed the bread on the counter between them, leaning her own hands against the worn wood. "Because my father taught me that a baker who turns away a hungry person is no baker at all," she explained softly. "He is just a man who happens to have bread, and that is not what this shop is about." The stranger fell silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the shelves before returning to her eyes. "Your father must have been a very wise man," he remarked. "My father passed away 2 years ago," Hazel said, stating the loss as a simple fact of her life rather than an appeal for sympathy. "But he was indeed a wise man, and I intend to keep his memory alive by running this shop the way he did." She pushed the wrapped loaf a few inches closer to him, encouraging him to take it. He reached out and picked up the bundle, and Hazel noticed that his hand felt slightly warmer than it had the day before, though it was still remarkably cool compared to a normal person's skin. "Thank you," he said, turning his body toward the exit. "Sir," Hazel called out, causing him to stop in his tracks and look back at her over his broad shoulder. "Do you have a safe place to sleep tonight?" The man studied her face with his dark eyes, as if searching for a hidden motive behind her question, before he gave a slow nod. "I do have a place," he answered quietly. "Good," Hazel said with a firm nod of her own, turning her back to the counter to return to her work at the oven. The stranger departed, the bell ringing softly behind him as he disappeared back into the morning fog. On the third morning, the tall man returned at the exact same hour, standing in the doorway and waiting for her to notice him. Hazel did not say anything this time. She simply smiled, took a large loaf from the shelf, wrapped it in brown paper, and held it out across the counter. The man walked forward and took the bread from her hands, but instead of turning to leave immediately, he paused and looked at her. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low and steady in the quiet room. Hazel realized she had not shared her name with a customer in many months, but she felt no hesitation in answering him. "My name is Hazel," she said. "Hazel," he repeated slowly, pronouncing the syllables carefully, as if he were trying to memorize the exact shape of the word. "And what should I call you?" she asked in return. The man paused for a fraction of a second, a brief moment of doubt crossing his face before he spoke. "You may call me Gideon," he said. "That is a fine name," Hazel said, a tiny smile catching the corner of her mouth as she looked at him. "Where do you come from, Gideon?" He looked down at the wrapped loaf in his hands, his expression turning somewhat distant and somber. "I come from a place that I never wish to return to," he answered quietly. "Then I will not ask you about it again," Hazel promised, respecting his privacy without any further curiosity. Gideon gave her a respectful nod of his head, turned around, and walked out into the street, leaving her alone with the smell of fresh yeast. Over the next 2 weeks, this interaction became a regular part of Hazel's morning routine. Gideon came to the bakery every single morning without fail, and he never had a single piece of coin to offer for his food. Hazel never asked him for money, always setting aside the best-shaped loaf of the morning batch for him, even though she tried to tell herself she treated all loaves the same. Sometimes he would linger by the wooden counter for a few extra minutes, and they would talk about simple things like the unpredictable Oregon weather, the rising price of flour, or a small bird that had built a nest above the bakery door. He never spoke about his personal life or his past, and Hazel kept her promise never to pry, but she found herself looking forward to the sound of the bell each morning. One chilly morning near the end of the second week, Gideon walked into the shop, and Hazel noticed right away that he was holding his right hand differently. A fresh, jagged cut ran across the back of his pale knuckles, the skin around the wound looking unusually white and bloodless. "What happened to your hand?" Hazel asked before she could stop herself, her voice full of immediate concern. Gideon looked down at his own knuckles, appearing surprised to see the injury, as if he had not felt any pain from it. "It is just a small thing," he murmured, dismissing the cut. "Come around the counter and sit down," Hazel commanded, pointing to the sturdy wooden stool near the hearth. Gideon looked at her with an expression of mild surprise, as if he were entirely unaccustomed to taking orders from anyone, but he did not argue. Hazel hurried into the small back room and returned with a ceramic basin of clean water and a long strip of fresh white linen cloth. By the time she came back, Gideon had seated himself on the stool, looking slightly awkward and out of place in the small room. Hazel took his large hand in her own, noting how smooth and pale his skin was despite his rough clothing. She carefully washed the dirt from the cut, watching his face for any sign of discomfort, but he did not flinch or pull away from her touch. "How did you manage to cut yourself like this?" she asked softly as she worked. "I attempted to help a local farmer whose wooden cart had broken down on the edge of town," Gideon explained, his eyes fixed on her movements. "A piece of the old timber split apart while we were lifting the frame, and a sharp splinter caught my hand. Did you manage to help him fix the wheel? Hazel asked, wrapping the clean linen tightly around his knuckles. Yes, the cart was able to move again, Gideon replied. Hazel finished tying a neat, gentle knot in the cloth to secure the bandage and let go of his hand. There, she said with a satisfied nod. It should heal perfectly well if you keep it clean. Gideon looked down at the white bandage on his hand, and then he raised his head to look directly into her quiet eyes. Why are you so kind to me, Hazel? He asked, his voice dropping to a low whisper. Hazel wiped her hands on her cotton apron, thinking about the question for a moment while the sounds of the town drifted in from the street. Because no one has ever been truly kind to me in my life without wanting something from me in return, she answered honestly. And I do not want you to know what that bitter feeling feels like. Gideon went completely still upon hearing her words, his dark eyes widening slightly as he stared at her face. He did not say anything for a long time, looking down at the wooden floorboards and then at the shelves of bread, avoiding her gaze entirely. He finally stood up from the stool, took the wrapped loaf she had prepared for him, and walked slowly toward the front door. He stopped with his right hand resting on the iron latch, his back still turned toward her. Hazel, he said quietly. Yes, Gideon? Thank you, he murmured, opening the door and stepping out into the street before she could reply. Hazel stood by the counter for a long time after the brass bell stopped swinging, her own hand still feeling a lingering trace of the strange coldness from his skin. She did not know what to make of the warmth growing in her chest, so she simply put the feeling away and went back to her daily chores. What Hazel did not know, and what she could not have possibly guessed, was that Gideon was not a penniless traveler at all. He was actually an ancient ruler, the king of a hidden night realm, who commanded vast lands, immense wealth, and an army of loyal subjects far beyond the borders of this small town. He had not wandered into her small bakery by accident. He had come to Pine Creek, disguised in ragged clothes, because his heart was filled with a deep, lingering question. For decades, Gideon had been surrounded by people who claimed to love and respect him, but every single one of them had eventually proven to be after his power, his royal title, or his endless wealth. The last person he had trusted had openly mocked him when he discovered her deception, claiming that no one could ever love him for who he truly was. Hurt and disgusted by the greed of the world, Gideon had left his royal court behind, traveling to this remote corner of the country to see if true, selfless kindness actually existed. He had expected the baker to turn him away on the very first day, assuming she would calculate the value of her bread and realize he was worth nothing to her business. Instead, she had given him food with a gentle smile, bandaged his hand, and spoken to him with genuine human empathy. During the 4th week of Gideon's visits, a heavy autumn storm settled over the valley, bringing 3 consecutive days of torrential rain that turned the dirt streets into thick mud. Very few customers ventured out of their homes, leaving the bakery quiet and empty for hours at a time. Hazel sat by her counter on the 3rd evening of the storm, counting the tiny handful of copper coins in her wooden box and feeling the heavy weight of financial worry. On the 4th morning, the heavy downpour finally stopped, leaving the morning air freezing, damp, and thick with fog. Gideon walked through the front door, his long cloak completely soaked through, and his striking white hair dripping wet against his pale forehead. "You are going to catch a terrible chill standing out in this weather," Hazel said immediately, coming around the counter to guide him toward the back room. "Come sit by the fire right now." Gideon did not protest, allowing her to lead him to the small wooden stool next to the burning logs in her private quarters. She quickly heated a small cup of water over the fire, dropping a few leaves of dried mint into it to create a warm drink, which was the only hospitality she could afford to offer. She placed the hot cup in his cold hands, and then brought him a thick slice of fresh bread, along with a small piece of hard cheese. The cheese was the very last bit of food she had left for herself in the pantry, having skipped her own dinner the previous night to save her remaining supplies. Gideon looked down at the small plate, his keen eyes immediately noticing how little food was left in her kitchen. "Hazel," he said, pushing the plate back toward her, You must eat this cheese yourself. I am not hungry at all today, Hazel lied smoothly, offering a firm smile even though her stomach was completely empty. Gideon quietly ate the slice of bread, but he left the piece of cheese untouched on the small wooden table. When Hazel returned to the room a few minutes later after washing some baking pans, she saw the cheese still sitting in the center of the table. You did not touch the cheese, Gideon, she noted, looking at him. I do not care for the taste of cheese, he claimed, his voice completely calm as he looked back at her. They both knew he was telling a generous lie to ensure she would have something to eat later, but neither of them pointed it out. Then I will simply save it for my breakfast tomorrow morning, Hazel said, placing the cheese back into its small clay storage pot. Gideon remained by the warm hearth for over an hour, the two of them sharing a comfortable, quiet companionship while she worked on her next batch of dough. When he finally stood up to leave the shop, he paused by the doorway and looked back at her with a serious expression. Hazel, why do you continue to give away so much of what you have when it is clear you have so little left for yourself? He asked. Hazel wiped the white flour from her hands onto her apron, looking at the small fire, and then at the empty shelves. Because a tiny gift given freely from the heart is worth far more than a massive fortune given for a price, she answered. That is what my father always said. Gideon gave a slow, thoughtful nod, stepped through the door, and disappeared into the fog. That very night, an anonymous messenger slipped a thick leather pouch under the front door of the bakery while the town was fast asleep. When Hazel opened her shop the next morning, she found the pouch lying on the floorboards and opened it to find 10 large, shining gold coins inside. She nearly dropped the money in absolute shock, as 10 gold pieces represented more wealth than her small bakery could generate in an entire year of hard work. A small slip of paper inside the pouch contained only a few handwritten words. For the bread, and for everything else. There was no signature and no name attached to the gift, but Hazel knew in her heart exactly who had sent it, even if she couldn't understand how a poor traveler could possess such wealth. The next day was the official market day for the town of Pine Creek, and the central square was filled with wooden carts, colorful stalls, and crowds of local shoppers. Hazel had carried a long wooden table out to the front of her shop, stacking it high with fresh, aromatic loaves of bread to attract the passing crowd. The wonderful smell of her baking drew a steady stream of customers, and she spent the morning happily exchanging her traditional loaves for bright copper coins. A young mother bought 3 loaves for her family. A local farmer purchased 2 rolls, and a little boy bought a sweet bun for his sister. The busy peace of the morning was interrupted when Mr. Higgins arrived, walking across the square with 2 of his young apprentices following closely behind him. Mr. Higgins stood in front of Hazel's table, wearing a spotless white apron and carrying himself with an air of immense pride as he looked down at her work. Miss Weaver, he said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of the surrounding shoppers, I see you are attempting to sell your country bread again today. Hazel kept her composure, looking back at him calmly. It is the same traditional bread my family has baked for 30 years, Mr. Higgins, she replied. Mr. Higgins reached out, picked up one of her loaves, turned it over in his clean hands, and made a visible show of sniffing it with disgust. It is far too heavy, dark and coarse for the refined people of Pine Creek, Mr. Higgins declared, tossing the loaf carelessly back onto the table, where it bounced and rolled into the dirt. Your father died penniless, your shop is falling apart, and your low prices are dragging down the reputation of our entire trade. We bakers must maintain high standards, and your cheap country bread makes a mockery of our profession. A few people in the crowd turned away in embarrassment for Hazel, while Mr. Higgins' apprentices shared a quiet laugh at her expense. Hazel felt her face grow hot with anger, but she refused to let him see her cry. If you do not care for my bread, Mr. Higgins, then you are entirely free to buy your food elsewhere, Hazel said, her voice remaining steady and clear. I certainly would not purchase this trash, Mr. Higgins sneered, leaning closer to the table. A woman has no business attempting to run a bakery alone, And if you continue down this foolish path, you will find yourself in the poorhouse before the winter snow arrives." The entire market square fell completely silent as people stopped their shopping to watch the confrontation, none of them willing to stand up to the wealthy businessman. Hazel did not lower her gaze. She looked directly into his mean eyes, refusing to show a single trace of fear. Instead of shouting or throwing the bread at his face, Hazel calmly reached down and picked up the loaf that Mr. Higgins had knocked into the dirt. She carefully brushed the dust from the crust with her hand, walked out from behind her table, and made her way across the silent square. The crowd parted naturally to let her through as she walked with her back perfectly straight and her chin held high. She approached a cold stone corner, where a frail, shivering old woman named Mrs. Gable was sitting with a small tin cup. Hazel knelt down on the stones, placing the large, warm loaf directly into the old woman's trembling hands. "Eat this slowly, Mrs. Gable," Hazel whispered softly. "It is still perfectly warm in the middle, and will give you strength." Tears filled the old woman's eyes as she nodded, clutching the warm bread to her chest as if it were a precious treasure. Hazel stood up, walked back across the square without looking at Mr. Higgins or anyone else, and returned to her place behind the wooden table. She picked up the next fresh loaf from her basket and turned to the next waiting customer. "2 copper coins, please," she said with a calm smile. The customer handed over the money with a shaking hand, and the square slowly returned to life. Mr. Higgins stood frozen for a moment, his face turning bright red before he turned and hurried away. Gideon did not show up at the bakery for the next 3 mornings, and Hazel found herself checking the front door constantly, despite her best efforts to focus on her work. The story of how she had answered Mr. Higgins' cruelty with an act of charity had spread quickly through Pine Creek, causing many new customers to visit her shop. People wanted to support the honest baker who stood up for the poor, and Hazel heard that Mr. Higgins' modern shop was suddenly struggling as neighbors refused to give him their business. On the 4th afternoon, a respectable older woman named Martha walked into the bakery, carrying a small shopping basket on her arm. "Are you Miss Hazel Weaver?" Martha asked, looking at her with a kind expression across the wooden counter. "I am," Hazel replied, wondering what the woman needed. "My name is Martha, and I wanted to come by to express my deepest thanks to you," the woman said. "My little granddaughter Lily is the child you gave the whole loaf of bread to a few weeks ago when she only had 1 coin. That single act of kindness kept our family fed during a very difficult week when my daughter was too ill to work, and I wanted to pay you the proper amount now that I have the coins." She placed 3 coppers on the counter. "You do not need to pay me for that loaf, Martha. It was a gift given freely," Hazel said, pushing the coins back. "Please keep them," Martha insisted, sliding the money back across the wood. "You deserve to be rewarded for your good heart. There is something else you should know, Miss Hazel," the older woman added, lowering her voice to a quiet whisper. "My nephew works as the stableman at the Timberline Inn at the edge of town, and he told me some very strange things about the tall traveler who has been staying there. The man everyone calls Gideon has been acting very mysteriously. He spent weeks dressing in tattered clothes, but recently he paid the entire debt of the town cobbler's widow in pure gold coins, saving her from being evicted onto the street. He also secretly paid the medical bills for the young boy who broke his leg at the lumber mill last month, making the doctor promise to tell the family the money came from the church. He even bought a thick, warm winter coat for the old man who sleeps on the church steps, leaving it beside him in the middle of the night so no one would see him do it. My nephew says the man told the innkeeper that if good deeds are not done in absolute secret, they are not true good deeds at all." Hazel felt her heart pounding furiously against her ribs as she listened to Martha's words, recognizing the tall, white-haired stranger in every single detail. After Martha thanked her again and departed, Hazel spent the rest of the evening sitting by her fire, trying to process the incredible truth about Gideon. He was clearly a man of immense wealth and power, yet he had chosen to live like a beggar in their small town just to observe the people. He had watched her struggles, tested her capacity for kindness, and then used his hidden resources to heal the hurts of the local community without asking for a shred of praise. She realized that his strange coldness, his graceful movements, and his incredible physical strength were signs of something far deeper than a simple noble title. He was a creature of the night, a powerful being who had lived for a very long time, yet his heart was capable of showing pure, unselfish protection to total strangers. Hazel knew she could not spend another day pretending she did not care about him or his safety. She waited until the clock struck 9 times, locked up the bakery, pulled her heavy woolen shawl over her shoulders, and walked out into the cold night toward the Timberline Inn. The moon hung high and bright in the clear night sky, casting a pale silver glow over the empty streets as Hazel walked quickly toward the edge of town. She reached the Timberline Inn, a simple building with a bright blue door, and knocked firmly on the heavy wood until the young innkeeper's boy opened it. She asked for the tall, white-haired guest named Gideon, and the boy immediately pointed toward the narrow wooden staircase, telling her he was in the very last room on the right. Hazel walked up the creaking stairs, her breath forming small white clouds in the chilly hallway air as she approached the designated door. She took a deep breath to steady her nerves and knocked 3 times against the heavy wood, waiting in the silence until she heard the sound of a chair moving inside. The door swung open to reveal Gideon standing in the entrance, and Hazel found herself staring at a completely transformed man. He wore no tattered cloak tonight. Instead, he was dressed in a long, elegant coat of black velvet, adorned with intricate silver embroidery at the collar. His striking white hair was neatly brushed, flowing over his broad shoulders, and his pale skin seemed to catch the candlelight with an almost ethereal glow. His dark eyes held a profound, ancient intensity that confirmed her deepest suspicions about his true nature as a powerful ruler of the night. "Come inside, Hazel," Gideon said softly, stepping back to allow her to enter the warm room, which smelled of rich cedar wood smoke and clean soap. A large book lay open on the small wooden table by the window, right next to a burning oil lamp and a silver inkwell. Hazel did not sit down, turning around to face him as he gently closed the heavy door behind her. "I came here tonight because Martha told me about the cobbler's widow, the sick boy at the mill, and the warm coat you left at the church," Hazel said directly. Gideon looked down at the floorboards, a brief expression of regret crossing his pale features, as if he were disappointed that his secrets had been uncovered. "Those are not matters that require any praise or attention, Hazel," he murmured quietly. "I am not here to offer you praise, Gideon," Hazel replied, taking a step closer to him. "I am here because a man who performs such profound kindness in absolute secret is someone I have never met before, and I did not want you to think I was angry with you." Gideon looked up, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch in her throat. "You told me once that no one had ever been kind to you without wanting something in return," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I must confess that I did want something from you from the very first day we met in your shop. I wanted to see if a human being could show genuine warmth to a penniless stranger without any calculation of reward. And I have spent the last 3 weeks realizing that your heart is the truest thing in this world. I could not sleep, because I feared you would never forgive me for hiding the truth from you," he admitted, his long fingers tightening against his sides. Hazel looked at his pale hands, remembering the jolt of coldness she had felt during their very first interaction. She thought about her father's lessons, her own lonely years of hard work behind the bakery counter, and the strange comfort she had found in Gideon's quiet morning visits. She walked across the small distance between them, reached out her hands, and gently took his large, cool right hand in her own. "I forgive you completely, Gideon," Hazel said softly, looking up into his pale face with a steady, reassuring gaze. Gideon closed his eyes for a long moment, a deep sigh escaping his lips, as his cold fingers wrapped gently around her smaller hand, holding it with absolute care. He did not pull her closer or attempt to kiss her. He simply stood perfectly still in the warm candlelight, drawing strength from her touch. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at her with a warmth that completely transformed his regal features. "May I continue to visit you at the bakery tomorrow morning, Hazel?" he asked, his voice full of quiet hope. "I would like that very much," she answered with a bright smile, showing that she was no longer afraid of his power or his true identity. The next morning, Gideon walked openly through the center of Pine Creek to reach the small bakery on foot, completely ignoring the shocked whispers of the neighbors who recognized his fine clothes. He spent the entire afternoon helping Hazel in the shop, effortlessly carrying heavy sacks of flour from the back room and learning exactly how she liked to arrange the fresh loaves on the wooden shelves. The local townspeople talked constantly about the strange courtship, and Mr. Higgins became increasingly furious as he watched his own business decline while Hazel's shop thrived. One evening, 3 weeks after Gideon had started visiting the bakery openly, Mr. Higgins stood in the middle of the crowded market square and began to shout slanders about Hazel. He claimed to a crowd of 30 people that the baker's daughter was nothing but a deceitful fortune hunter who had used a clever trap to ensnare a wealthy nobleman. He did not realize that Gideon was standing right behind him in the shadow of the local inn. Gideon walked calmly through the crowd, the townspeople instantly parting to clear a path for him as an aura of absolute royal command settled over the entire square. He stopped directly in front of Mr. Higgins, his tall frame completely dwarfing the arrogant baker, as the entire market fell into a terrified silence. "You will never speak her name with disrespect again, Mr. Higgins," Gideon said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the square, without him even raising it. "If I ever hear you utter another cruel word about Miss Weaver, I will personally buy the lease to your building, turn your shop into a mule stable, and make you clean it every morning." Mr. Higgins' soft, round face turned completely pale, the color of spoiled milk, as he trembled under the weight of Gideon's intense gaze. "Yes, Your Grace, I understand completely," the wealthy businessman stammered, backing away in absolute terror, before turning to flee from the square. Gideon turned around and looked across the open space, seeing Hazel standing in the doorway of her bakery, with flour on her apron and a few strands of dark hair falling loose from her knot. He walked over to her with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just a foot away while the entire town watched in silent fascination. "Hazel Weaver, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife and my queen?" Gideon asked, holding out his large, pale hand toward her. "Yes, Gideon, I will," Hazel answered clearly, her voice echoing in the quiet square. He took her hand, lifted it gently, and pressed his forehead against her knuckles, in a gesture of profound devotion, creating a beautiful moment that the people of Pine Creek would speak of for generations. That very evening, as they sat together by the small fire in the back room of the bakery, Hazel asked him why he had chosen to live this way. Gideon stared into the flickering flames, his expression turning thoughtful and distant as he shared the memories of his long life. "When I was a young child, my royal father took me through a starving village near our great manor, and he deliberately turned his face away from a poor woman who had no shoes on her feet," Gideon explained. "My father told me that if a ruler looks at the suffering of the world, he will be forced to act, and there would be no end to the demands on his wealth. I spent centuries following his example, turning my face away from the world until I came to this town and discovered a woman who refuses to look away from anyone who is hungry. 1 year later, on a beautiful morning in the late autumn, the wonderful smell of fresh baking bread filled a magnificent stone kitchen in a grand mountain manor far above the valley. The room was spacious, featuring a smooth flagstone floor and a massive stone hearth where a roaring fire burned brightly to heat the large brick ovens. Hazel stood at a long oak table in the center of the room, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows and a light dust of white flour coating her cheeks as she expertly shaped dough into round loaves. The head cook of the manor stood beside her, watching her movements with an expression of deep affection and respect. "Your Grace, you really do not have to perform this heavy labor every morning," the cook said with a warm smile, repeating the same gentle protest she offered every day. "I know I do not have to, Mrs. Hatch," Hazel replied with a cheerful laugh, "but baking bread with my own hands is what brings me the greatest joy, and I will never stop doing it. Hazel carefully slid the prepared loaves into the hot brick oven, closed the heavy iron door, and wiped her hands on her clean white apron. She heard the familiar sound of firm, slow footsteps echoing down the grand hallway, and her heart lifted with immediate happiness. Gideon stepped into the kitchen, stopping in the open doorway to admire his beautiful wife, as she stood by the wooden table. He crossed the stone floor, took her hand in his own, and pressed a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his skin now feeling perfectly warm and full of life. "You have a prominent smudge of white flour right on your cheek, my love," he murmured with a soft smile. "I have flour absolutely everywhere, Gideon," Hazel answered, looking up into his dark eyes with complete contentment. He used his thumb to gently brush the flour from her skin, his touch full of a deep, enduring tenderness. In a quiet corner of the expansive kitchen, the old man who used to sleep on the church steps sat comfortably in a wooden chair, happily eating a thick slice of warm bread. Little Lily sat on the floor near his feet, laughing joyfully as she played with a small gray kitten that belonged to the manor stables. The cobbler's widow was resting in a sunny sitting room just down the hall, contentedly sewing a new quilt by the large glass window. When Hazel had agreed to marry the vampire king, she had asked if she could bring the poor and forgotten people of the town with her to live in the safety of his manor, and he had granted her request before she could even finish asking the question. Martha entered the kitchen from the garden, carrying a large woven basket filled with fresh herbs, to begin her daily work in the still room. She offered a respectful nod to Hazel and Gideon, completely avoiding any formal curtsies, because Hazel had specifically asked her friends to treat her as an equal. Gideon pulled out a heavy wooden chair, sat down at the table, and happily drank a cup of hot tea that the cook had prepared for him without a single word. He was an entirely transformed ruler now, no longer hiding from the world or closing his heart to the needs of others, having learned from his wife how to truly look at the suffering of the world and heal it. Hazel took a small, perfectly shaped loaf of bread from the cooling rack, wrapped it securely in brown paper, and handed it to a young boy who was waiting patiently by the kitchen door. The child was the son of a local tenant farmer whose family had been struggling through the autumn harvest. "Tell your mother that the price of bread dropped completely down to nothing today," Hazel said with a warm wink. The boy grinned happily, thanked her, and ran out into the bright morning air, while Gideon watched with a proud smile. The future stretched out before Hazel like a long, bright path winding through the green valley, completely stripped of the cold shadows and lonely struggles that had once defined her life. As she looked out the large glass window at the autumn leaves, turning brilliant shades of red and gold, she realized that true kindness was a powerful force capable of changing the hearts of both humans and kings. Her father's simple values had not led her to the poorhouse as Mr. Higgins had predicted. Instead, those values had brought a lonely king out of the dark and created a haven of healing for an entire community. She knew there would be challenges in the years to come as they ruled their hidden realm together, but she felt no fear because she carried the warmth of the ovens and the absolute devotion of her husband in her heart. They had built a bridge between two entirely different worlds, using nothing but a shared loaf of bread and a refusal to look away from the hurts of the world. And that love would endure through the passing of time.